Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, today I have my spiritual gangster t-shirt on. I'm going to try and live up to the moniker, and I'm going to be helped very much by our guest, who's Professor Andrew Newberg, who really is at the intersection of two topics that we discuss a lot on this program, one being science and the other being religion. But we're going to stay away as far as possible from the sort of political discussion of those things. And today we're going to focus more on, let's say, the active practice of things like of religion and how that can be a source of comfort and hope and really daily sustenance to people who practice it. And Professor Newberg is also going to be able to tell us, inform us about some very fascinating science that he's been working on surrounding the practice of religion and how it actually impacts the brain. So we're going to introduce him, but before we go there, as we always do, we're going to frame the discussion with a few aphorisms that I've chosen in honor of today's guest. The first one is from a scientist from the last century, Albert Einstein, and he famously wrote, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." The second one is from another great philosopher and theologian from history, Thomas Aquinas, who wrote, "Believing is an act of the intellect, assenting to the divine truth by command of the will, moved by God through grace." And finally, another Jewish theologian from the 20th century, of whose writings I'm a great admirer. This is Martin Buber, who wrote, "A person cannot approach the divine by reaching beyond the human. To become human is what this individual person has been created for." So here we turn to Dr. Andrew Newberg. I'm going to call him Professor today. He's told me he's not offended by that, which is great. And so a little bit about him before we meet him. He's a neuroscientist who studies the relationship between brain function and various mental states. He's a pioneer in the neurological study of religious and spiritual experiences, a field known as neurotheology, which is a term I had never heard before. His research includes taking brain scans of people in prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states in an attempt to better understand the nature of religious and spiritual practices and attitudes. He is also the director of research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health and a physician at Jefferson University Hospital. He's board certified in internal medicine and nuclear medicine. Andrew has been asking questions about reality, truth, and God since he was very young. He has long been fascinated by the human mind and its complex workings. While a medical student, he met Dr. Eugene d'Aquili, who was studying religious experiences. Combining their interest with Andrew's background in neuroscience and brain imaging, they were able to break new theoretical and empirical ground on the relationship between the brain and religion. Andrew's research now largely focuses on how brain function is associated with various mental states, in particular, religious and mystical experiences. And his research has included brain scans of people in prayer, as I said, prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states, as well as surveys of people's spiritual experiences and attitudes. He has also evaluated the relationship between religious or spiritual phenomena and health and the effect of meditation on memory. He believes that it is important to keep science rigorous and religion religious. Nice way of putting it. Andrew has also used neuroimaging research projects to study aging and dementia, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, depression, and other neurological and psychiatric disorders. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this program.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you. This is a really fascinating area, this concept of neurotheology. I'd never, honestly, I'm not familiar with it at all. And when I was researching you and your work in preparation for today's discussion, I have to say, I was quite fascinated, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about the work that you've been doing. I'm not surprised to hear because people who follow this program know that I'm a person of faith who has a spiritual life. I'm not surprised to hear about the power of prayer and the power of meditation. I'm also someone who practices these in my daily life, and so I know the benefits of them.
Sure.
Sadly, too many people are estranged from them, and so I'm very hopeful when people talk with you or hear from you today that they're going to see the connection between let's say the mystical aspects of prayer and meditation and the actual empirical scientific benefits. So for a start, why don't you give us an explanation of the term neurotheology and maybe share with us how this field has become recognized as an important area of medicine?
Sure. So I think to me, the simplest definition of neurotheology as a concept is that it is a field of study that seeks to understand the relationship between our brain and our religious and spiritual selves. So that's the encapsulation of the definition. But then for me, for it to work as a term, I think there's a couple of very important points about it. One of them is that it is to me, for neurotheology to work as a concept and as a field, it needs to be a two-way street. And that includes things like what you said a few moments ago about keeping science rigorous, but also making sure that we keep religion religious. And what I mean by the two-way street is that neurotheology is not science looking at religion, although that does happen at certain times. It is not religion evaluating science, although that happens as well at times. But ultimately, it's bringing those two very powerful parts of humanity, the religious and spiritual on one side, the science technological on the other side, to help us understand who we are and how we can best become ourselves and best connect to the world, to the rest of humanity, and to be the kind of people we ultimately hope we can be. So to me, it's a very idealistic piece of bringing together these two fundamental parts of who we are. And then the last thing I'll say, at least at the moment, about the definition of neurotheology is that I also think for it to work as a term, that you need to have the neuro and the theology sides both defined fairly broadly. So the neuro does include neuroimaging and neuroscience, as we'll be talking about. It includes the broader medical world and how our brains intersect with mental illness and physical illnesses. It can include anthropology, it can include sociology, psychology, all the different ways that we kind of get at the mental processes that are associated with our brain. And then, of course, theology is a very specific discipline that takes a particular religious tradition and kind of breaks it down and analyzes it. And we can do that. We can look at that from a brain perspective too. How does our brain try to understand, the nature of sin, the nature of free will, whatever questions that we have. There's a brain process that's involved in that as much as there may be a religious or spiritual process. But then there is also the spiritual practices, the experiences, the beliefs, all the other aspects that go into what religion and spirituality make up for people. And to me, that's all part of what neurotheology can be. So, and I think, part of what I get excited about also as for neurotheology as a field is that it extends all the way from very esoteric concepts, again, things like the nature of free will, the nature, is there a soul and how does that intersect with our brains and our minds, to very practical applications. Is meditation or prayer useful to help people with depression, anxiety? So there's this huge range of what neurotheology can ultimately look at. So for me, it's an exciting field. I've been involved in it for the last 25, 30 years. You mentioned my late mentor, Eugene DeQuilly, who was fascinated by it. Interestingly, this little nugget about neurotheology is that the first mention that I could find of it was actually in an old science fiction novel by Aldous Huxley called The Island that was published in 1961. And it talks about this very futuristic society that does all these kinds of, interesting things. And one of them is neurotheology, but he doesn't talk about what it is. He just mentions it. It wasn't really until more recent times where the term has started to get some traction and people are starting to look at it as an actual field.
We're going to add that one to our reading list. We've talked about one of his other books often on this show, Brave New World. I'm excited about this concept of neurotheology too, and actually, part of the reason why I am is because looking back at, let's say, the early Enlightenment scientists, people like Sir Isaac Newton and Sir Francis Bacon, they really saw science as being the discovery of the secrets that were hidden in the natural world by God. And so they really had a sense of
Right.
the connection between science and God. But then in the post-Darwinian era, of course, everyone knows about the famous case, the United States, where they debated, the Genesis story versus in the post-Darwinian era. There's sort of been this breaking apart and this tension between, let's say, religion and science. And to me, it seems like that is really not. It's not only unnecessary, but it maybe is counterproductive. And so I really like this idea of fusing them, bringing them back together under a sort of a common umbrella of humanity. Is that kind of the point of neurotheology?
I think it's a very important point. To me, in a similar kind of context, I mean, I've always been a little concerned, upset about the fact of this, this great divisiveness between science and religion, and I think that while there may be certain places where it's more challenging to bring them together, like talking about the origin of the universe. I think certainly when it comes to the mind and our experience and how we think about our world and understand our world, that to me is a very natural place for us to be able to look for a stronger relationship between science and religion. Because again, if you read the Bible, well, you're using your eyes, you're using your language areas, you're feeling emotions. So you can talk about the biology of what's going on when you're doing that. It doesn't take away from the fact that you're doing that, and it certainly doesn't take away from the religious or spiritual implications of what you're reading about. But how that all kind of comes together within you as a person. I think there's some really fascinating possibilities and opportunities for science and religion to work together. And part of what I've been excited about over the years, with regard to the work I've been so fortunate to do, is that I feel that to some degree, everyone, regardless of their religious or spiritual background, has an opportunity to get something out of it. So whether a person is very devoutly religious, whether a person is very atheistic, different traditions and so forth. There's so many, it's all about understanding who we are and understanding each one of us for ourselves, but also for each one of us to understand the other people who are out there. And I think there's just some great opportunities for us with this particular field.
Okay, that is a great introduction. Now I want to get into some of the scientific nitty gritty and see how this works. So, broadly speaking, we want to talk about how do meditation and prayer change our brains.
Okay.
And when I looked on your website, there was something called a SPECT image at baseline and during meditation, and something called an orientation area. And I'm just going to give this explanation, and maybe you can elaborate. It says to look at the neurophysiology of religious and spiritual practices, you use a brain imaging technology called a single photon emission computed tomography, SPECT, which allows us to measure blood flow. And the more blood flow a brain area has, the more active it is. And you have red, yellow, green, blue, black. And it says that when you scan the brains of Tibetan Buddhist meditators, you found decreased activity in the parietal lobe during meditation. The lower right shows up as yellow rather than the red in the left image. And this area of the brain is responsible for giving a sense of orientation in space and time. And you hypothesize that blocking all sensory and cognitive input into this area during meditation is associated with the sense of no space and no time that is often described in meditation. Okay, that sounds very scientific. Can you break that down for us? Take that out of the ether and bring it down to the level of the rest of us who aren't scientists?
Sure. Well, you said it perfectly. I mean, there's a couple of important points. I mean, we use a variety of different kinds of brain scans, and as the scientific geek, so to speak, I mean, part of what I get excited about is thinking about how we're even going to design our studies. And if you're going to do a certain kind of prayer or certain type of practice, I need to learn how it's done, what you're doing. Are you moving? Are you lying down? All these different elements of it. And then from there, we start to decide what kinds of studies that we can do so that we can capture what's going on in the brain. And you mentioned this SPECT imaging, which has certainly been one of the more prominent types of approaches, techniques that we've used. What it essentially does is we actually start by putting a small intravenous catheter into the person's arm. We start off with a little IV, and then we have this line that kind of runs away from them, so that when they're doing a particular practice, whether they're seated, moving, I mean, we've done some practices where they're actually moving around quite a lot. We did a study of people speaking in tongues, where there's, a lot of movements and arm movements that, as long as they don't yank the IV out, what it allows us to do then is at some particular moment during the practice, we inject them with a little bit of a radioactive tracer. And that's where the single photon emission comes from, because it's radioactive and it emits a little bit of radioactivity. The tracers themselves go to different parts of the brain or the body, and blood flow is one of the most common ones, because like our car engine, that's the analogy I always like to use. I mean, if you want to go faster, you step on the gas pedal, because what it does is it delivers more gasoline to the engine and you go faster. So blood flow is basically the gasoline for the brain, and it delivers oxygen and nutrients so that those neurons can start operating and functioning faster while you're using them, whatever it is that you're doing. And then by the same token, if something sort of quiets down, something shuts off, then that amount of activity, that blood flow starts to decrease. And when we inject people, what's kind of cool about this particular technique is that this tracer circulates and it gets up into the brain. And for all intents and purposes, it kind of gets locked into the brain. So if I were to inject somebody who is listening right now, and then they finished listening, and then maybe they got a little something to eat, and then they got into the car, and then they drove over to their hospital and got into the SPECT scanner, the results of the scan would tell me what was going on right now when I did the injection. And all the other stuff that happened afterwards, once that tracer gets in there, is not really relevant. So it's a great way of capturing a snapshot of the brain at a given moment. And in this case, we're studying, the moments of prayer, meditation, spiritual experience. So we inject people. We've injected Buddhist meditators, and we've studied almost every kind of tradition and practice. We've looked, as I said, we've studied speaking in tongues. We've studied nuns in Christian prayer. We've studied Muslim prayer, Jewish prayer, Buddhist, Hindu, a lot of the major traditions. And then what we do is we look at the differences between the active state doing the prayer or meditation, and compare that to some neutral state, whether it's being at rest or something that's similar to the state, but just not doing the prayer practice. And then we look at the differences, and we can look at the areas of the brain that turn on, the areas of the brain that turn off. So in the particular scan that you were talking about, that's referring to an area that's in the back part of our brain, the back top part of our brain. It's called the parietal lobe. And normally it takes our sensory information to kind of put together our sense of self. And so, in fact, well, actually, the one that you're looking at right now actually is also looking at the frontal lobes, which are sort of to the top of the screen. And again, the frontal lobes are also involved in our sense of self, but in the sense of what we do purposely, what we do that we purposely try to do. So when you start to do a prayer practice, you're focusing your mind on the prayer. You're focusing on an image, the words, whatever it is. And what you see on this particular scan, for those who can see it, is that there is an increased amount of red activity in the frontal lobes. It means that the frontal lobes turn on. And we see this in a lot of different spiritual practices where you are concentrating, where you're focusing your attention. And that basically means that you turn your frontal lobes on. And this is actually very relevant, not only for understanding the practice itself, that you're doing this thing, that you're concentrating on something, but it has some interesting implications down the road. And I know we may talk about this a little bit later, about the potential therapeutic effects of these practices, because the frontal lobes help to regulate a lot of other stuff going on in the brain. One of the things that they do is that they kind of regulate and control your emotional responses. So if you're a very anxious person, if you increase your frontal lobe, that will decrease your anxiety. And that's exactly, that's what a lot of the meditation-based programs have been designed to do, especially the ones that are more secularized. that they help people to reduce their stress, to reduce their anxiety. And in part, this happens because of the way the frontal lobe turns on during the practice, and that helps them to regulate their emotional reactions. Now, you mentioned the other aspect of the scan, which is the parietal lobe. So this is more in the back of the brain. And as I was starting to say, this is a part of our brain that helps us to create our spatial sense of self. And so this is the part of the brain that when we're walking out a doorway, we walk through it instead of, into the side or something like that. And when it turns on, it helps us to say, here's where I am, and there's where other things are. But when it shuts off, then we kind of lose that spatial representation of ourself. We begin to blur the boundary between where our self is and other objects in the world. And so one of the most common experiences that people in deep meditation or prayer have is a loss of the sense of self, a sense of oneness. It could be a sense of connectedness, a sense of closeness to God, for example, or a connection with God in a very deep and fundamental way that's different than just, I'm connecting to you. And as I talk, it's like I feel a deep interpersonal connection. I become one with, in some ways, God or, whatever the object of the practice is. So when those kinds of experiences happen, we tend to see decreases in the parietal lobe. And I think ultimately, all of this has really broader implications for how we understand what these practices are about. I mean, to me, it always made sense that, if God created human beings, it would make sense that we would have a brain that could somehow reconnect back to God. I mean, it would be sort of silly if God created us and gave us no way of actually having that kind of connection. So, it makes sense that we then can use our frontal lobes, our parietal lobes, and different parts of our brain to think spiritually, to make these kinds of religious and spiritual beliefs, to understand those concepts, and to have experiences that help us to feel that deep religious or spiritual feeling.
We that explanation reminds me of a recent guest that we had in the program who was actually a sports psychologist, and he talked about something similar to what you've just explained, Professor, but he was framing it in terms of a left brain, right brain experience, where he was describing the left side of the brain as being the one that is, and I'm sure this is an oversimplification for a neuroscientist, but one that's involved with analysis and what we call day-to-day conscious activity, problem solving. And part of what he was working on with athletes is trying to spend more time on the right side of the brain, more and this is in terms of people like Eckhart Tolle would call this, consciousness, where they forget themselves for a while, as you were describing,
Right.
And so when they can tap into this right side of the brain, or at least quiet the other part of their brain, they're more conscious, and they're more tapped into, let's say, the spiritual aspect of life, so that when they're engaged in playing a sport, they're actually playing a sport, as opposed to trying to avoid being involved in that experience and trying to avoid error or shame or guilt or those types of things. Does that sort of tie into what we're talking about here, where the prayer and meditation sort of gets people spending more time focused on another part of their mental activity?
Well, there's definitely some relationship to what your prior guest was saying and some of the things that we're talking about. Ultimately, the brain is extremely complex, and we do look at left versus right, and there are some distinctions about that as well. But there's also different networks in the brain. There's something called the default mode network, which is the brain kind of at rest, and so all of these different processes are kind of going on and around. In fact, when I'm often asked, is there like a God spot of the brain? I often say, no, there's not just one part of the brain that kicks in when we become spiritual, but in many ways, it seems that there are many different parts of the brain that become active or affected, I should say, and so part of what we see going on, it makes sense when people are religious or spiritual. There are there are emotions, there are cognitive processes. their experiences that we have. So, from my view, it's really the entire brain that becomes involved in spiritual experiences. And so, but one of the things that I think I appreciate about what your prior guest may have been saying is that when what you're ultimately trying to do is try to integrate all those different parts and those different processes and take advantage of the ones that make you feel like you are into that sense of flow, into that sense of, just the experience itself, and not overly monitoring it. And so, yes, some of that is a left right thing. Some of it is a frontal lobe versus emotional system kind of thing. In fact, when people get into flow states, they frequently talk about the frontal lobes quieting
Right.
down. And so, that's
Love the
another,
term that you use with
yeah.
flow
So
state. Yeah.
there's a lot of interesting pieces, but there's definitely a connection. There's a whole continuum of these experiences from, these very, what we regard just like a very basic kind of spiritual experience, walking into a church or something like that, to maybe more intense states like a flow state that a very good athlete might get into in an intense, game or
Hmm.
competition, to the mystical experiences that other kinds of people will have, monks and nuns, and but anybody can have them, obviously.
Hmm.
That really takes you to sort of this other different kind of level.
Hmm.
So there's definitely a lot of very complex interactions going on in different parts of the brain, and that's what we try to look at. So we can get simplistic and say the frontal lobe does this or the
Hmm.
parietal lobe does that, but they're all working within this larger network of the brain, and everybody sort of has ways of thinking about how we can kind of take advantage of those different parts and processes to optimize our overall functioning, and that can be very valuable and can work very well.
So, what do you think is the most important for people like yourself to consider the field of neurotheology and its significance in medicine? In other words, you've described some of them. What are the really practical applications of neurotheology in terms of helping people deal with illness and other types of mental disease?
Well, the whole, there really is a whole broader field of spirituality and health, or religion and health. Hundreds, if not thousands, of articles have been written over the past several decades, and it's very exciting work. On a very basic level, studies have shown that people who have higher measures of religiosity, and that can be subjective measures. People talk about the importance of religion in their lives, to more objective measures, how often they go to church, for example, that those people who are more religious or spiritual tend to have lower rates of heart disease, of cancer, and even of all-cause mortality. They tend to do better health-wise. Now, part of what I look at from the neurotheological perspective is, so what let's assume that that is the case. What are the mechanisms by which that may happen? And there are what I call both indirect as well as direct mechanisms. So the indirect mechanisms, for me, are which we can also look at, are the practices and the things that people do as part of a religious tradition that, by the way, happen to be good for your health. So, for example, if you decided to become Hindu and develop a vegetarian diet, well, there's a lot of data to support the fact that plant-based diets are healthier for us. They reduce heart rate and so forth. So when people eat better and eat well and eat more plant-based diets, they do better. Now, that's not because they are religious, although they might be doing it because of their religion. But that's a kind of an example that we're talking about.
Mhm.
The other thing, of course, is that most religions will tell you, don't drink very much, don't smoke, don't engage in high risk activities, don't be promiscuous. That's pretty much what every doctor has been telling their patients for the last 100 years, and we'd have a very healthy society if people tried hard to do all those things. So if you're sort of following the tenets of your religion and trying to lead a moral life, there could be the ancillary benefits of you just happen to be leading a very healthy life as well. Now, there are also what the direct mechanisms, and we've talked a little bit about them, which
Mhm.
is that some of it has to do with the things that you do to make you feel religious and spiritual, the practices like meditation and prayer. Um, just the very fact that people who are very ardent believers may derive a sense of optimism, a sense of meaning and purpose in life. All of these things are also part of what helps people to survive, in the long run. I mean, again, one always has to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. There's plenty of atheists who live to 100, and there's plenty of very religious people who die young. But overall, when you look at the population, the more that people kind of derive coping and all these different positive effects of religion and spirituality in their lives, it can be very, very beneficial. And of course, the practices like meditation and prayer in particular, not only do they change the brain, as we were talking about, but because they can reduce things like stress and anxiety, they reduce your heart rate, they reduce your blood pressure, they enable your immune system to work more effectively. So there's a lot of physiological effects that occur that ultimately are also very beneficial for people. So there's a lot of evidence out there to show that, one, the mechanisms by which being a religious or spiritual person may be beneficial, but that it ultimately does seem to translate into that as well. Now, what I often say to people who are, who really struggle to find religion as an important part of their lives, there are other ways of engaging this kind of spiritual part of ourselves. So there is the more traditional religious view, and which is great and works for a lot of people. But for those people that it doesn't, there are approaches through creative outlets. I've had people tell me that their art or their music is their spiritual outlet. Being in nature, helping your fellow man type of thing. So those are all wonderful ways of trying to still engage that spiritual side of who we are to make us feel connected to the world, connected to humanity in deep ways that still have benefits for us. And and then the last thing I'll say in the moment is that the one flip side of this, which to me is also a very important part of what neurotheology needs to look at, are the times when religion and spirituality doesn't work out so well for people, where people wind up having a struggle with their religious beliefs or attitudes. In the medical world, especially in certain conditions like cancer or addictions, sometimes people get very angry with God or feel that God is punishing them. And of course, if you feel like God's punishing you because you were a bad person when you were younger, well, you're not going to comply with treatments. You're going to just sort of, so your outcomes are not going to be that good. And then there are, sort of the truly problematic religious or spiritual things that happen to people, like joining cults or a terrorist who, is going to go out and kill a bunch of people in the name of God. So, I think part of what neurotheology needs to look at is, what is the difference in the brain of somebody who says, I'm a very religious person and I love humanity. It doesn't matter what your faith is. I'm going to love you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to support you. And I'm going to feel very strongly about my faith and how important it is to me, and derives all that very positive elements from it, versus somebody who says, I'm very religious too, but I'm going to kill people who don't believe the way that I do, or I'm going to engage in very negative behaviors, either for me or the larger community. And I hope that by trying to help people study that, we can try to redirect people in more positive ways and find ways of doing it. And people are trying to do that, through things like traditional psychotherapy that brings in different religious concepts and topics. Can be very effective for helping people overcome not only mental health issues, but the spiritual issues that they face as well.
So it sounds like this concept of neurotheology is not just a fusion of, say, science and religion. It also is sort of a confluence of different disciplines within science and also religion, so that it's bringing together a lot of different ideas and concepts and fields of study, and it sounds like advancing all of them in different ways. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I certainly hope so. I mean, I really do view it as a very multidisciplinary hybrid kind of field that, even when people ask me, who are interested in getting into it, and I say, well, there's a lot of different avenues. I mean, you can go into it more from a medical biological side, like I did. You can go into it from a theological side. You can go into it from a more a therapeutic, practical side, social work kind of side, and you can go into it from a philosophical or theological side. So there's a lot of different ways that people can engage it, which is, to me, again, why I think it is a very potentially exciting field going forward, because it does bring together a lot of very interesting ideas and helps us to think about them in ways that perhaps we haven't brought them together before in the past, and maybe we should, and maybe we can learn more about ourselves.
So, having said that, you've been involved in this in this field for a number of years now. What are the most exciting discoveries? Some of the highlights that you found over the past maybe 10 or 20 years in your field?
Well, not to be overly grandiose, but every time I do a study, I get it. It's to me, it's sort of like walking on the moon for the first time. When you first study speaking in tongues, or when you first study Islamic prayer, or whatever, like you really don't know for sure exactly what you're going to find or what you're going to see. So in many ways, I've been very fortunate, because almost all of these studies are kind of groundbreaking and looking at things for the first time that no one has ever done before. I think, part of maybe the best way for me to answer your question is that part of what I take from this so often are a couple of things. One is that I'm always struck so much by the genuineness and how important and the power that religious and spiritual beliefs and experiences and practices have for people. And I really can appreciate that, and how important that is for everyone. I'm also struck by the fact that, on one hand, there are ways of trying to group together the different aspects of these experiences. So there are, there's common ground, and yet at the same time, there's enormous diversity. We ran a survey of people's most intense spiritual experiences, and got about 2,000 different responses. And we talk about a lot of this actually in an upcoming book called Varieties of Spiritual Experience. And, on one hand, we can find the common elements, and we can find that sense of oneness that we talked about earlier, a sense of clarity, for example, that people derive, the intensity of these experiences. But on the other hand, every description was almost, completely unique. And so, on one hand, there's sort of this unbelievable diversity of these experiences, but we can also strive to try to find some common ground. And that to me has been, one of the big take-home messages for me, that, on one hand, these experiences are available to everyone. I think anyone can have these kinds of experiences. And by the same token, I think it's also important for us to realize that diversity of those experiences, and to appreciate the fact, and to be compassionate and understanding of the fact that people may have come to some ideas and beliefs and experiences that are different from our own. And even when I look at it from a purely brain perspective, you start with each of our unique genetic backgrounds, wherever we come from, how our parents raised us, the schools that we went to, the books that we read, the stories that we were told, our own experiences that were good, painful, traumatic, wonderful, that bring us to, where we are today. To me, if there's 7 billion people in the world, there's 7 billion different religions, there's 7 billion different moral perspectives, political perspectives. And I hope that that's part of what we learn from our understanding of the brain, and what neurotheology can teach us. So I hope that, that there are some ways for us to not only learn about ourselves as an individual, but how we are similar and as well as unique in comparison to everyone else around us. So those to me have been the big kind of take home points, and the big messages that I have seen. But it's so exciting always to see what's going on in the brain, and then to think about where that takes us, and how that helps us to learn and understand who we are.
When I was reading about the sort of dream and trance states that you have studied, I was drawn back to actually some of the stories in the in the Bible, and in particular, there's a wonderful set of books that have been written by a man named Dennis Prager about the Torah. That's called the Rational Bible. And in that book, Mr. Prager talks about and explains why it was important in the Jewish tradition for there to be a personal relationship with God. And he uses the example, the famous story of Jacob, who has this dream at night where he's wrestling with an angel.
Right.
And then of course he becomes renamed Israel, which is translated means wrestles with God.
Right.
And so I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't it have been fascinating if you could have had, the sort of technology hooked up to Jacob when he's having this dream. But it seems to me that there's a lesson there. The wisdom of the ages is that maybe there's a reason why, talking about the Jewish tradition particularly, but it sounds like you've discovered this in some of the other ancient religions as well, the importance of having this personal relationship with God. Is that a fair is that something that you've seen in your research?
Yeah, I think that's a very common element, and it kind of it speaks to that connection, and so that is one of the fundamental core elements of a lot of these spiritual, enlightenment, mystical kinds of experiences, and exists along a continuum. I mean, it can be just the sense that, okay, God's with me, to that very, very powerful, truly, wrestling in a very profound way with God, which incidentally was my daughter's Torah portion for her bat mitzvah.
Oh, really?
But so I appreciate that reference. But yeah, I mean, I think that does become an important part, and in fact, some of the like interesting, this is where again you get into these interesting studies on neurotheology, where a study that was done, it was not one of mine, but somebody looked at conversational prayer. So people having a conversation with God, and found out that basically they activated the same brain areas as when they're having a conversation with a person. So, it really, on a very fundamental level, there isn't this, unbelievable spiritual thing that pops out of our head and says, okay, it's time to, it's our brain, and it's our way of understanding who we are. It's our way of making that connection. And it is a very, very powerful source that a lot of the social areas of the brain become affected by these practices and experiences. So that's exactly what people have been observing, and I think that also then turns back into your question about some of the therapeutic aspects of things. That when you feel like you have that type of connection, that type of support, it becomes a very powerful way of helping to cope with and manage and deal with the challenges that so many people face. And I think that becomes a very important part of that.
I neglected to ask you earlier on when we were going through your biography. How did you first become interested in this field of study? Obviously, I mean, I would think that at the time when you were a student, back in that's, I'm going to guess, in the 80s when I went to university, that this was really brand new, that nobody really ever heard of this. Is that so? How did you get sort of hooked onto this frequency?
Well, I mean, on one hand, I was very lucky to have wonderful mentors. And you mentioned Gene DeQuilly, but a lot of it really does go back to, when I was a kid, and, I was just always asking questions about why there were different religions, and how do we know which belief system is
Hmm.
right and wrong. And, if we're all looking at the same world, how can we come up with, why are there Democrats and Republicans? I mean, like, how can we all figure this out? And,
You must have had lovely parents.
you know what, I would go in, and I would sort of wander in 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I was supposed to be in bed at 8 or whatever. And I would ask that question to my father, and he'd say, well, what do you think? So now I got to go back and figure it out. Um, but that was, I mean, that was sort of what happened. He said, he didn't discourage me from thinking about it. He said, go, what do you think? And so I had to go back and actually start to contemplate this. And my first thought at one point was, well, our brain is what takes in all of this information, and so let me look at the brain, and let me study the neuroscience and how the brain works, and that should give me an answer. And it gave me a lot of answers. I did very well with that for a long time, and kind of around the time when I was in college, began to realize that there were certain limitations that science had, as wonderful as it is. And so I thought, well, we're talking about, it's bumping up into questions that are philosophical and theological, and about, the mind and soul and consciousness. So then I started to study different religious traditions and philosophical perspectives and so forth. And that was wonderful. And that kind of, got me down a path, but that had certain limitations, especially when it comes to the material aspects of our world. And all of this stuff was kind of swirling around in my mind when I started into medical school. And again, I just had the good fortune of having two wonderful mentors. One who kind of introduced me to the whole world of imaging and studying the brain in a very empirical kind of way, in a very research and scientifically oriented way. But then I also met this other gentleman, this Gene DeQuilly, who was a psychiatrist and an anthropologist by training. And he had actually been asking some of these questions as early as the 1970s. But when we all kind of came together, we started to talk about this, and we started to develop ideas about what was really going on in the brain. And then eventually, as the proverbial light bulb went off, and I said, well, wait a minute, if we're studying the brains of people with depression or anxiety, why can't we study the brains of people who are praying and meditating? And that was what, in the mid 1990s really started to kind of launch, I think, in a more formal way, what this field of neurotheology ultimately could become. And then, when we published our first work, there was one or two articles out there on meditation practices, for example. And then over the last 20 years or so, now there's several hundred articles that have used imaging to study meditation practices and various types of other spiritual practices, spiritual experiences. So it's been wonderful and very rewarding to me to see how the field continues to grow and develop, and then starts to go into different directions, the very practical directions, the theologians who want to talk about implications for things like worship and free will and so forth. So it's been very exciting, and it to this day, I mean, it continues to be my sort of combined scientific and spiritual journey, and I sort of feel like by bringing them together at some point, that's our best opportunity to find an answer to that big question, my big burning question, which is, how do we know what's real, and what do we do with that? As I always say, if I ever figure it out, I will certainly let everyone know. But I sort of feel that continuing to have this kind of combined approach, which ultimately gets expressed in a field like neurotheology, I think is our best opportunity to be able to do that.
It's obvious you're very passionate about finding the truth of these matters. It's palpable. It's funny when you were telling the story about you and your father. It reminds me of something that happened to me when I was a boy. We didn't have a lot of books in our house. We had with the King James Bible, and we had a set of encyclopedias. It only went up to 1969.
What's an encyclopedia?
One time I asked my father, I said, Dad, why does everything end in 1969? But more importantly, one thing I'm curious about is how receptive has the medical profession, the clinicians and medical practitioners, people who are actually treating patients, how receptive have they been to this type of new therapy? Has it been something that's finding its way into practice, or are you finding there's some resistance?
Well, a little bit of both, certainly. I think over the years, certainly more and more physicians are realizing that people are not just these sort of biological pieces of meat with a disease, but there's a person behind them, and they have a psychological world, a social world, and a spiritual part, a spiritual dimension as well. And so, really trying to help people and heal people as effectively as possible. There have been, you mentioned in my introduction and being part of an integrative medicine center. Well, that's what we think about, that it's not just the biological part of who we are, but we need to take into consideration all these different other dimensions. And now, there are integrative medicines in a lot of oncology groups and, other hospitals around the country. So there's definitely been a great deal of growing interest in this relationship. And part of what I hope, and this goes back to another point that you made very early on about kind of keeping the science rigorous, if we continue to do good science and we don't just, go down, paths that sound very, problematic and crazy and out there, then I think it does enable people who are in the more traditional world of psychiatry and psychology and so forth to be able to understand the importance of that relationship between the spiritual side and the psychological side as well. So I think having this kind of information ultimately is valuable to people on all sides, and has helped to be able to bring about a greater appreciation of what the spiritual side of people is. And so, I hope that as we continue to do research, we'll see more and more of that. And by the same token, I think, we see this on the other side of the equation. I've had some recent conversations with people in pastoral care, people who are, ministers and have churches and synagogues that they work with, how to help them understand the biological piece of what they're doing and the impact that has. So there's a lot for both sides to learn. And I think people more and more are certainly appreciating it and feel that there's a value to thinking about things with this kind of hybrid approach.
One of the things I really like about what you're studying is that I'm not sure how to put this without offending people, but to some degree, we in the West have made a god of science, haven't we?
Yeah.
And we've forgotten about religion. And one of the things that I really like about what you're doing is, although it is scientific, there is the hard scientific aspect to it. It is also advancing interest in and promoting interest really in religion and the benefits of religion. And so that for a lot of people, they think that religion is some sort of primitive hocus pocus mumbo jumbo, but actually, as I alluded to earlier, it's the wisdom of the ancients. Even leaving aside the spiritual aspects of religion, there is so much to learn from religion as part of, let's call it, the historical record of humanity. You can learn a lot about humanity, about us as human beings, from religion. And so this is really great that, and again, getting back to my original comment about this let's say this tension between science and religion, in a real sense, what you're doing, your research is also advancing interest in religion, isn't it? Now maybe that's incidental, or is that by design?
Well, no, I think there's a value, because I do think there's a deep value in both sides. And I love science and what that has to say about the world. I love the philosophy and the theology and the spirituality that is so valuable to people. Ultimately the question is, to what extent do these get balanced within us? And that's, I don't have an answer to that question. Again, that's part of why I love the concept of neurotheology, because to me it's about the two of them coming together, but in what kind of a way, and how much of each and so forth, that's what we don't fully know. But to a large extent, my guess is that it really depends a lot on each individual. Again, this is something that grows out of my interest in the field of integrative medicine, is individualized medicine. And so, there are people who have a deep spiritual and religious life. And so it is very important to make sure that we understand that and help them to embrace that in the ways that work best for them. There's some people who don't feel very religious or spiritual, and it's important to kind of understand what's going on with them, and to help them to achieve their optimal life as well, and whether that's through science or through some other spiritual avenues that might be valuable to them. I think, again, ultimately, I hope that it's an ability to have each person kind of appreciate people who have these different perspectives. But yeah, no, I mean, as far as the value and the importance of that other, the other side of science, the philosophical, spiritual, theological, I think ultimately it's going to be necessary to have some part of that. And again, whether it's 5%, 30%, 90%, I'm not entirely sure. But I think that that's part of why I feel like there is a value in encouraging us to think about both sides of the equation, because these are massive questions that really kind of defy so many different approaches, so many singular approaches at least. And hopefully, again, by finding the right interconnectedness and finding our right pathways through, we'll find some of the answers that are helpful for us as humanity. And looking around today, we need some answers.
We sure do. We've never been more consternating questions than what we have right now. And obviously, everybody's in need of, after what we've been through globally, and I would say especially in the West over the past 2 or 3 years. I mean, everybody is in need of some peace of mind and some ways of feeling better about themselves and about life. And so this is a very exciting field that you're in. Professor, you've been very generous with your time. We're so grateful for it. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I wonder if you could perhaps point people to some resources where they can learn more about you, more about the work that you're doing, website or whatever, something of that nature. Sure. Where could people find you and find out more about the work that you're doing?
So the easiest way is through my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com, and they can look up some of the research articles that we have and see some of the books and try to follow where we go in the future, and some sometimes even be able to participate in some of our work and our projects. So we need everyone's help to help us figure out these big questions, and hopefully we can help each person kind of find their own way as they go down their own journey. So there's a lot of exciting stuff for all of us.
Well, I know that you've authored a number of books, both yourself and collaboration with others. This is the part of the program where people who follow us regularly know is called the reading list.
Okay.
And hopefully it won't shock you today to learn that your book, or one of your books, is our recommended book today. It's called Neurotheology. Surprise, surprise, how science can enlighten us about spirituality. And this book was written, looks like just last year.
Right.
And the description here is: religion is often cast in opposition to science, yet both are deeply rooted in the inner workings of the human brain. With the advent of the modern cognitive neurosciences, the scientific study of religious and spiritual phenomena has become far more sophisticated and wide-ranging. And it says, what might brain scans of people in prayer and meditation or under the influence of psychoactive substances teach us about religious and spiritual beliefs? And so this book, I guess, will go into a lot more detail about what we have been talking about here.
Absolutely.
One last question before you go.
Sure.
Is the timing of the publication of this book is interesting. Were you working on this book before we ventured into the COVID-19 pandemic, or was what happened maybe part of the impetus for writing the book?
No, I believe that the writing actually started a little bit before the whole pandemic came about. But it does, certainly I think there's a lot of relevance for just how we respond to the issues that we face and the stressors and the challenges that we have to deal with in all of our lives, whether they are the global pandemic issues, or whether they're individual relationship, life, spiritual struggle issues. And that's really what the book is designed to help people to do, and to give them to me, one of the things that I always find problematic oftentimes, both in science as well as in religion, is that you get the scholars, the high level people who almost kind of speak beyond what anybody else can understand, and what I hope to accomplish.
Thanks for not doing that today, by the way.
Well, I mean, to me, everybody has the ability to think about these things. I love hearing what people's questions are. Everybody should challenge their ways of thinking, should challenge their beliefs, should ask questions about the nature of the world, the nature of God, the nature of humanity, and so forth. We don't have to all be the Einsteins and the Aquinas of the world, although obviously those are wonderful people too. But part of what I find so valuable is looking and learning from individual people, and just the everyday person that we all are. And in fact, I mentioned a little while ago our survey of spiritual experiences. We could have just taken the experiences of Mother Teresa and big, great monks and so forth, but we wanted to know what everybody kind of felt, and what the general person would just experience. And so again, this to me is so important for us to realize the value of each one of us, the value of each one of our own struggles and questioning. We're all on these paths to knowledge and understanding, and so trying to have that language and to be able to explore that and bring in these new perspectives. Somebody who wasn't a scientist before, who was just kind of going down oh yeah, that's interesting. When I do my prayer, my frontal lobe's doing something, and what's happening to my emotions, and even though they don't have to know about the amygdala and the hippocampus, but just there's an emotional part of my brain that's doing this. So what's going on, and how does that all intersect and interact? Those are some great questions, and hopefully we'll all get there together at some point.
Well, we certainly appreciate your comment about assuming that everybody who's tuning in here is intelligent. We make that assumption. Otherwise, they'd be on Instagram watching somebody's dog skateboard. But
I just watched that the other day. It was great.
Yeah, it's fun to watch. This book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, everywhere people will find books.
Yep, absolutely.
So you mentioned a new book that you just finished writing.
Yes. So a new book coming out called Varieties of Spiritual Experience, which is going to be coming out September 1st. And This is also a very exciting project that I was involved in with one of my former students, who's now one of my colleagues, a gentleman named Dr. David Leighton. And this pays homage to the original book called Varieties of Religious Experience by William James back in about 1902.
Oh, yes.
William James, for those who don't know, was probably one of the most prominent scientists of his day. A lot of people don't know about him as much, but he was the head of the American Psychological Association. He was a very big person in the worlds of both psychology as well as philosophy and theology and so forth, and really had a very big influence on this field. Of course, he wrote that 100 years before we ever had an MRI scanner or anything like that. So this is kind of looking at the 21st century version of that, and with all the new knowledge and data and information that we have from all the studies over the past 25, 30 years. But also appreciating the work that he did as well. So it kind of introduces people to the sort of the historical arc of this whole field of neurotheology, and then leaves us understanding a little bit better what those varieties of spiritual experiences are. And as I mentioned earlier, there are certain categorizations that we can make, some groupings and common aspects of these experiences that people can find and think about their own experiences in that context, but also appreciate the uniqueness of each person's experience and how it has an impact on their personal life.
Thanks very much for those recommendations. Just so you know, full disclosure, your books will be added to the anthology that's part of this program. We have a collection and reading list that's available on our website. And Professor, we just want to thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm very fascinated by your work. I hope that has been obvious. And I think many other people, everyone watching this and taking this in, will be as well. We're very happy to have you, and we hope that you'll come back and talk to us again, perhaps in September when your new book comes out.
Absolutely, be happy to. We're just scratching the surface.
Yes. Well, you're scratching harder than most of us.
I'm trying,
which is great. Yeah.
All right,
thank you, Professor. It's been a pleasure meeting you and talking with you today.
Thank you very much.